In this video, we'll explore a critique of Nagel's view. Our capacity to conceptually distance ourselves from the immediacy of our position in the world, to detach from the subjective processes and forms of life that ground our involvement with the world, confers upon us a degree of self-consciousness that is quite remarkable. At the very same time, this growth of self-consciousness has hollowed the world of meaning and produced a form of consciousness more disconnected from the source of its own life than ever before. Objective expanse has produced a split in the self whose agitation is felt in the nihilism and discontent of the age. Nagel's book offers a compelling diagnosis of this fundamental conflict or split in the life and thought of beings like us, albeit from a highly theoretical perspective. And he also offers the possibility, at least in some instances, of reconciliation. Ultimately, however, Nagel's philosophical vision succumbs to the very same ambition toward objective expanse that he elsewhere criticizes. As long as outer ascent to more objective realms remains disconnected from the sources of life that sustain it, the objective views we attain will only further to alienate us from ourselves. What is currently needed is not a journey outward, but rather a journey inward, a descent into worlds of mystery and magic. It's only in the descent into the depths of psychic life that the sources of life which sustain us can be reconnected to. Nagel sees the task of philosophy as the attempt to reconcile two different and often conflicting standpoints that beings like us are capable of taking. Philosophical problems like the mind-body problem, the problem of skepticism and of free will, arise due to a clash or conflict between two fundamental conceptions. When we view the world from our own point of view, from a first personal perspective, we see and apprehend the world as it appears to us, through the particular subjective determinations of our senses, culture, and forms of life. Our grasp of the world is attained through a particular place within that world. However, we are also able to detach from the subjective standpoint and view the world from the outside, from a third personal or objective point of view. When we detach in this way, we leave behind the particular modes of justification and living that ground our involvement in the world from our first personal perspective, from our place within the world. We expand ourselves outwards, encompassing more and more of reality in our objective conception of it. The world and the subjective perspectives that we've left behind become the object of a more universal gaze, a view subspecie aeternitatis, which attempts to grasp the world from no particular place at all, from no particular location in the world. A view from nowhere that any rational and numerate being would also in principle be capable of taking. For Nagel, this is the most exciting and interesting thing about beings like us. But the journey out into more objective realms doesn't come without its risks or dangers. The problem is that this more detached view arises out of the subjectively determined view it is attempting to leave behind. But we ourselves can only attain the detached view from a place within the world, and thus an internal tension between the two conceptions or standpoints arises. The subjective conditions out of which the more objective view arise really do exist, but the objective view gains its status as objective only by leaving those subjective conditions behind. If the subjective conditions out of which the objective view arises exist, however, then the objective view will run the risk of mistakenly taking itself to be a complete view of the world when in fact it isn't. It runs the risk of hastily and falsely reducing the world of appearances to mere appearances. Nagel writes, "There are things about the world and life and ourselves that cannot be adequately understood from a maximally objective standpoint, however much it may extend our understanding beyond the point from which we started. A great deal is essentially connected to a particular point of view, or type of point of view, and the attempt to give a complete account of the world in objective terms detached from these perspectives inevitably leads to false reduction, or to outright denial that certain patently real phenomena exist at all." Nagel goes to great lengths to avoid the dangers and pitfalls of an excessive objective ambition, but ultimately I think his view succumbs to the same type of general philosophical malaise that psychophysical reductionism does. And that arises from treating phenomena teeming with life and intelligence of their own as if they were static, abstract concepts. This result, I think, is a product of his rationalism, a rationalism that also infects most versions of empiricism. I actually sense this in Nagel's proposal of a dual aspect theory and in his conception of the objective self. Dual aspect theory, or property dualism, suggests that certain concepts that seem to refer to entirely and irreducibly subjective states, processes, or events, such as the concept of a mental state or of the self, also have essentially objective characteristics. That is, they can refer to both essentially subjective characteristics and essentially objective characteristics simultaneously. For example, Nagel thinks that the concept I have of myself, qua self, a concept that I use to identify myself through time, may pick out something that is essentially subjective, something that lies beneath and holds together the stream of psychological continuities that make up my psychic life, but he also thinks that it refers to something objective, something potentially that can be located in the objective order as the physical brain. At the very least, dual aspect theory allows us to gesture toward these irreducibly subjective states, processes, and events. But dual aspect theory serves as little more than a placeholder for them. We've got a place for these odd, intractable phenomena, but we have said almost nothing about them. Everything seems just as mysterious as it was when we started out. It is as if Nagel has allowed us to gesture toward or give a nod to the processes and events that most directly impinge and make a meaningful impact on our lives, but then he turns us away from them and directs our attention back to the cold detachment of the more objective view. On this way of viewing his dual aspect theory, subjective states, processes, and events are functionally at least just as dispensable as in the theories of psychophysical reductionism that Nagel is attempting to ward against. Nagel makes it clear that he is not interested in developing a phenomenology of the mental. But I think that is precisely what is needed to do justice to the inclusion of essentially subjective states and processes in an account of the real. What I think we need to attend to as we begin to investigate essentially subjective states and processes, such as those associated with the mind or the self, are not their correlates or dimensions that ground out in the physical and objective order. This really is just to come to rely, once again, too heavily on a conception of physical objectivity, after all, but rather the fact that these subjective states and processes open up into an entirely new region of being, a liminal zone in between the material and the mental, a dimension of psychic life in which awareness itself seems to teem with primordial intelligence. In our capacity to detach from the subjectively determined perspectives through which the world appears to us, and place them in the world that has now become the object of our thought, we in some sense are able to climb over our own heads and view ourselves from the outside in. But this detached objectivity that Nagel directs nearly all of his attention towards is not the only type of objectivity there is. Climbing over our own heads is a route to one form of objectivity, a detached form. But there is yet another route that we can travel along, a route that does not take us further outward and away from our subjectively determined view of the world, but rather a route which leads us inward, that carries us along dark and ambiguous currents into the depths of our own being. In these dark depths, worlds of mystery and magic open up, vistas of intelligent life whose operation governs the movement of the world of appearances in much the same way that plate tectonics govern the fundamental geological formations of the Earth's lithosphere. While Nagel finds new worlds in his journey outwards into more objective realms, a less traveled route, taken by the most intrepid of sojourners, opens up inwardly, disclosing dimensions of psychic life whose influence and character can only accurately be described as objective. The sense that we give to this objectivity of the inner world, however, is not easily articulated. But I think it must be acknowledged by any sincere philosophical investigation into the nature of things. What I offer here can only be a general sketch, of this alternative road that so few have acknowledged, let alone traveled upon. We begin in the same place as the detached conception, with the way things appear to us from our subjective point of view. The first step on the journey inward is also the same as the journey outward, to notice that the contents of our thoughts and impressions are to a large extent determined by our own subjective capacities. But this is where the similarity to the outward journey ends. From here, we take cognizance of the fact that for any appearance, there's someone, or rather something, to whom the appearance appears. This is to notice a perpetual awareness both behind and in every conscious state. It isn't, however, as in Nagel's view, a purely abstract objective self. It is to notice that appearances arise and fade away or transform into the next sequence of appearances within a vast depth of awareness. When such an inward view is taken up, appearances take on a kind of contingency. What is there as the appearance that it is, but any other appearance could have taken its place. Both the traffic jam and the trip to the park on a sunny day are contents floating in the vastness of this awareness like clouds to the sky. This generates an attitude of indifference toward the appearances. Even if we can't get behind them entirely, the indifference we feel toward their contents begins to reveal the chains of habituation and association that have to a large extent fixed them as the contents of our lives. To recognize the radical contingency of the content of the impressions is already in some sense to disrupt the normal unconsciousness which sustains and supports them. When attention is united to inner awareness, the contingency of the appearances is viscerally felt, offering up a choice as to how the appearance should be related to, the attitude through which the appearance should be engaged. This could range anywhere from remaining calm and centered in the traffic jam to facing torture and execution with equanimity and grace. The latter obviously being much more difficult to attain and likely only attainable by rare and select individuals. From here, the malleability of the appearances only increases. If an appearance can be determined in this way, it can also begin to establish new chains of habituation and association through its downstream effect on future chains of impressions. The calmness maintained during the traffic jam carries over into the next sequence of appearances, generating a kind of karmic cascade. Not only do the appearances then appear as contingent, they also appear to a greater or lesser extent as malleable. The connections between them and the sequences they initiate are fluid, sustained by a deeper and more primordial level of awareness. If we then withdraw from the contents of appearances even further, focusing on this primordial awareness itself, whole new dimensions of being emerge. Suddenly, there is no need of focus because the objective ego has submerged into the vastness that supports it. Here, the outer world of impressions and thoughts fades away, and an inner world of images and symbols emerges. This is a domain of mystery and magic, where images, symbols, and even awareness itself expresses an intelligence and life of its own. It's difficult to say anything about this dimension of things at all, since here the norms that govern our ordinary thought and talk about the world begin to break down, leaving only experience as our guide. The nocturnal episodes recorded in Carl Jung's Liber Novus can be referred to as an example of this. Once a view of the world has been taken up from the inside, the next question becomes how to reintegrate that view back into the view of our everyday lives. In the depths, one didn't detach from the appearances, but rather traveled behind and into them, finding that appearances are upheld and sustained by a primordial intelligence and awareness. Appearances are then invested with a numinous glow, a quality of the depths that is carried back to the appearances. A quality of inwardness now shines through them. One views the world not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Appearances are seen not as substantial realities in their own right, but as signs or symbols of an inner world of mystery and magic. It's hard to know how deep this awareness might go, whether or not there is any limit. Nonetheless, as the inward journey is taken, a new appreciation and understanding of the world of appearances is gained. One has invested the outward appearance with its inner reality, closing the gap between the appearance and the depth, a gap perpetuated and sustained by the journey outward, which insists that the only way to achieve the ideal of progress and objectivity is to get away from the reality which supports the world we are attempting to understand. The reality revealed, the world disclosed through the inner journey, is an objective world. It can be discovered and experienced by anyone with the willingness and courage to do so. The possibility of other non-human beings accessing and moving within these depths is a real one. Whole worlds await discovery. The insistence that the only way to achieve objectivity is by detaching ourselves from the source of life that sustains us has resulted in a catastrophic relationship to the world. We have the power to call down the stars, but we don't even know who we are or how to control our habitual and unconscious responses to the environment. There are, however, interesting parallels between the outward and the inward journey. Take, for instance, Nagel's description of his rationalist epistemology. He begins with the image of Neurath's ship, but then suggests that, quote, if we wish to depict the great objective advances on which real progress depends, we need a different image. Though we may incorporate parts of the original ship in the new one we are about to create, we call up out of ourselves most of the materials from which we will construct it. The place which we occupy for this purpose may be one we could not have reached except on the old ship, but it is really in a new world, and in some sense, I believe, what we find in it is already there. Each of us is a microcosm, and in detaching progressively from our point of view and forming a succession of higher views of ourselves and the world, we are occupying a territory that already exists, taking possession of a latent objective realm, so to speak. The image of the outward journey that he presents here sounds quite hermetic, in fact. And if it were not for the fact that the view he proposes is ultimately emptied of all the nutrients of the depths which would actually sustain it and give it life, it would be admirable. Having drunk from the living water of the interior world, Nagel's vision feels more like an empty vessel or a leaky sieve. We try to hold reality within it, but as soon as it enters, it dissipates. There's one more comparison to draw here between Nagel's outward journey to more objective realms and the inward journey that I have described here so far. And this is in regard to Nagel's realism. For Nagel, the world is more than can be grasped in our thought. And an important insight into our own lives is that there are points of view and aspects of the world that we likely will never be able to comprehend. Concepts that we could never grasp, even if some other being with a constitution radically different from our own could. What we can think and speak about is likely only a fraction of what actually is. Nagel writes, any conception of the world must include some acknowledgement of its own incompleteness. At a minimum, it will admit the existence of things or events that we don't know about. The issue is only how far beyond our actual conception of the world we should admit that the world may extend. I claim that it may contain not only what we don't know and can't yet conceive, but also what we never could conceive, and that this acknowledgement of the likelihood of its own limits should be built into our conception of reality. This amounts to a strong form of anti-humanism. The world is not our world, even potentially. It may be partly or largely incomprehensible to us, not just because we lack the time or technical capacity to acquire a full understanding of it, but because of our own nature. This decentered view of the world is suggested when we detach from the way the world appears to us. I will likely never know what it's like to be a bat, or what scrambled eggs taste like to a cockroach, yet such a point of view does in fact exist. There is no telling how far our ignorance may reach, what worlds and concepts will forever remain unavailable to us. For there to be points of view, concepts, whole worlds of which one could, in principle, never know about or grasp, encourages a receptivity to and humility in the face of the world which we find ourselves within. Such a view, I believe, is also recommended by the inward journey, and possibly represents a point of convergence on both the inward and the outward paths. For there are depths to the psyche that we may never be able to reach, given the particular form in which beings such as ourselves are currently incarnated in. The inward journey seems to extend indefinitely, no amount of inward travel capable of exhausting its depths. Maintaining an awareness of this inexhaustible depth allows us to remain receptive to the world encountered on the journey inward, receptive to worlds of mystery and magic, to listen and to be guided by that which draws us deeper into the creative springs of life from which the world of appearances emerges. To acknowledge this realism about the inner world is simply to point to something beyond which we can say very little about, but whose recognition is nonetheless fundamental. There are, of course, obvious concerns about the view I have presented here, and anyone on the journey inward will soon enough find themselves grappling with them. The first is that if we treat the contents of the inner world as expressing a kind of intelligence, life and objectivity of their own, how do we then distinguish between different kinds of inner happening? Are all inner happenings equally objective on this view? Or are some inner happenings mere appearances that we can leave behind? Can we distinguish between a genuine vision and encounter with the real in the inner depths from hallucination or from a psychotic episode? In the outward descent, we at least have the guardrails of reason and science to keep us from going too far over into the abyss. But what sort of guardrails exist on the journey inward? While reason and science don't seem to me to have prevented us from plunging headlong into the abyss, I do think there is a deeper question here, which I don't know how to answer. It might be worth suggesting that maybe there is more truth in hallucination and psychotic episodes than is commonly supposed. Descartes, after all, finds the certainty of his own existence in the midst of a whirlpool of hallucinatory doubt. Hallucinations and psychotic episodes are, of course, far more confused and disordered than anything about the view I have presented here, but maybe that's simply a failure of any attempt to try and explain the descent into the inner worlds accurately. There's a real sense that in the journey inward, the guardrails are thrown out, that one is left to maneuver by a means that one doesn't or can't have complete access to. A new sense begins to develop by which one steers and is simultaneously steered. Maybe this is something akin to what Heraclitus meant by the logos, not a strictly rational or conceptual grasp on things, but something more akin to mantic insight generated by the convergence of an intelligence far beyond our grasp with our own. The view here needs further development. Another objection, one that commonly arises when the inward journey is mentioned, is that the outward journey has discovered new objective worlds that have revolutionized our understanding of the cosmos and ourselves. The dubious pursuits of mysticism and magic have not. Furthermore, the reason the outward journey has been so effective while the inward journey has not is because the outward journey is grounded in what is real, while the inward journey is mixed up in illusion and falsehood. Those who follow the inward path are, to use a term from William James, tender-minded with no stomach for reality. The first response here is to bring in a line of criticism that Nagel too avails himself of, that one shouldn't expect the same results from methods designed for different purposes. Detaching from appearances and placing ourselves in the world that is to be understood is one way of getting at what is, but it isn't the only way. As Nagel himself asserts, objective understanding of the world doesn't exhaust everything about the world that can be understood. Forming a detached conception of the world is one way of understanding it, but not the only way or even the best way. The view revealed in the journey inward is not a detachable view, one that we could either decide to continue to pursue or, like Hume, quote, dispel with 3 or 4 hours of amusement by dining and playing backgammon with friends. Rather, once the journey inward begins, there's no stopping it. It's an initiation. There's no choice about whether one is to continue to go forward or retreat back to safer ground. One is continually drawn deeper along its paths, even despite oneself. The view transforms our vision of the world. Nature herself resonates with new generative meanings that draw us deeper into her mysteries. Another response to the objection, while not definitive, involves considering the social pressures and norms grounded in the very real psychological motivations of individuals that are involved in the production of knowledge. From a young age, we are inculcated with an implicit respect for reason and science. Understanding their efficacy and importance is not something that most of us have to strain to grasp. Rather, their truth and efficaciousness are assumed from the outset. We could very easily, however, imagine a world in which the norms and social pressures involved in the production of knowledge were different. Such a world is depicted, for example, in Borges's short story, The Lottery of Babylon, in which a shadowy corporation called simply the Company enforces a sacred disorder, perpetuating, quote, an infinite game of chance that would make our reliance on math, logic, and the laws that predict the regularity of nature seem nearly incomprehensible as measures of what is. Try as we might to get them to accept that some conclusion follows necessarily from a given set of premises, or that certain beliefs they hold commit them to a definite moral position, we would not be able to convince them. The strength of the social norms and pressures would be too great in the face of our attempts at conversion. I think we find ourselves in much the same situation when suspicion about the inward path is aroused, and its untrustworthiness taken as an obvious truth. We simply don't have the kind of cultural infrastructure that would make these paths more readily available and understandable for those inclined to travel upon them. Often a person's introduction to the inner world is chaotic, hallucinatory, precisely because no stable cultural edifice provides the materials and support to make sense of it. But of course, technical procedures for traveling along these paths have been around for millennia, along with well-documented accounts of the terrain one might expect to encounter. The tools and resources have been ignored by the vast majority, and will likely continue to be ignored into the future. We have no idea what worlds await discovery in the inner depths, and insisting that these depths don't exist or don't provide a genuine and authentic route to the real will only further agitate our already fractured selves that the journey outwards has wrought. To heal that wound, one must go inward and rediscover the primal source of creative life within. To accept the view I have proposed here would be to enact a radical break from the traditional modes of philosophical investigation that have dominated the Western world. But that is not to say that such a view is without its historical precedents. In future videos, we will take our cue from the phenomenologists, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, for instance, the radical empiricism of William James, and the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. We'll look to the pre-Socratic philosophers and the rich religious, philosophical, and magical traditions embedded within the Orphic and Pythagorean communities that had such a widespread influence not only on ancient Greek culture, but on the West in general. And we'll look to the Hermetic, alchemical, and esoteric traditions that carried these currents forward. So thanks for watching, and consider subscribing to the channel if you've liked what you've seen so far, and stay in touch as we continue to unpack and expand upon these views.